What tools do we need to implement offline support? Firstly, we need the HTTPS. We'll do some risky stuff with the HTTP requests. That's why we need to use properly encrypted data. But anyway, you probably need the HTTPS for many different reasons beside offline support. And secondly, we need some more JavaScript code on the front end. This code is basically about serving some locally cached files and data in case when connection is broken. So we have this HTTP channel between a browser and the server. Browser requests files and other stuff, and server gives what he can. And let's say we refresh a page, but meanwhile the connection was lost. Normally, when we fail to download an HTML file, we immediately get a no internet page with a dinosaur. But today we can fix that with the service worker. It will keep track of all requests for a given web page, and when it comes across a failed request, it can replace it with something else. Basically, it can be anything, but usually we provide some older copy of a failed response. Service worker can save this copy to a user's machine on his first visit to a website or at some other point in time, depending on your caching strategy. To be able to save these copies, service worker needs some caching mechanism, something that will save resources permanently to a client's machine. Today we have plenty of tools for that, but the most relevant ones for offline support are CacheStorage and IndexedDB. You may be wondering, what about HTTP cache? It can also substitute requests with some cached resources, and it does this automatically for us. So why do we need all this service worker stuff? Well, HTTP cache is really great for some static assets, but it doesn't help with the root HTML file, and thus it's not enough for offline support. Service worker lives in a separate file, which has to be deployed on the same origin as the page that it wants to control. In case of Twitter, we have an SW JavaScript file for that. Its text won't explain too much because Twitter didn't mean to make it readable for us. Later I'll show you a small example project that will be very visual and self-explanatory. For now, we can see at least some interesting syntactic features that a normal JavaScript environment doesn't have. In a service worker, we often use a self property, and unlike a regular JavaScript code, it refers not to the window but to a service worker itself. And the window, by the way, is unreachable from a service worker. And we have an import scripts method, which can import other JavaScript code. In this case, all the significant logic lives somewhere inside these imported scripts. They tell the browser how to handle HTTP requests. In some cases, they choose to put an HTTP response into the cache. In other cases, to use this cached response instead of going to the network. This service worker file is executed independently of a main application. It works somewhere in the background and may keep working even after we close the page. It's somewhat like a browser extension. For example, like an extension, it has to be installed, though this process is automatic and invisible to a user. We can inspect a service worker in the Application tab. First of all, it tells us that this worker is activated and running. It means that it was successfully installed and now controls the pages under this origin. Here we can also stop a service worker and do lots of other things for some development purposes. And here we can make sure that Twitter has cached an HTML file and a bunch of JavaScript files, and used CacheStorage for that. CacheStorage is yet another way to store information in the browser, so that this information was available to an application when a user revisits the page. We already had cookies, local storage and session storage for that, but they are kind of not powerful enough, and they aren't good for performance because they block the execution of JavaScript. And CacheStorage is a more efficient technology which is designed to store HTTP responses. It's a sort of a dictionary that says, for this HTTP request I have this response, and for that request I have that response. Cache storage can store all types of responses, but in practice it's primarily used to store files. CacheStorage API exposes a number of methods to read and write these network responses. You may call these methods from anywhere, including your main JavaScript application, but more often you will use them inside a service worker. So at some point, perhaps on my first visit to Twitter, this service worker told the browser, let's make these requests and save their responses to the cache storage. And later the service worker went to the cache storage to get cached files and fabricate a response without actually using the web. Network tab tells us that some files were provided by a service worker. And by the way, this happened on a normal connection. So this service worker actually doesn't care if you are offline or not. It just always tries to use the cached files. This is the most basic and straightforward approach, but it's not the only option. Actually, here are two caches at once trying to intercept requests: CacheStorage and HTTP cache. This cache here means that this request was replaced by HTTP cache. It's weird, but yes, any request may be intercepted by both caches. So you'd better understand how HTTP cache works and what are the relations between two caches. Basically, cache storage is enough to build a minimal offline support. We can put all the critical application files to the cache storage and using these files build an offline website. But it will be static and empty, because the dynamic data doesn't live inside the HTML or JavaScript files, but it's usually requested separately in a JSON format. And technically, we could cache JSON responses with cache storage. But if you have some large amounts of complex data, and you want to query this data in a performant way, then you'd better try IndexedDB. Just like the cache storage, it can basically store anything, including files, but it does this in a completely different and much more sophisticated way. In practice, it's primarily used to store not files, but some structured data. This allows us to make high-performance searches across this data. IndexedDB is also used by Twitter. There is some data about me cached here. And I guess that's why Twitter is able to show my profile details even without connection. Frankly, I think in this case IndexedDB was most likely an overkill because this data doesn't seem to be very complex. This was a very basic overview of technologies required to build an offline available website. Next, I'll show you a slightly more primitive but more explanatory example of a network-independent application.